Hello, everyone. Welcome, wherever you are, whichever part of the world you are joining us. It's a real pleasure to have you on this really great day when we are going to be launching a very important report for South Africa on the state of innovative finance and the mapping study we've just done. And as you come in, because we're a community that likes to connect and just get to know each other, even virtually, can you please use the chat function to type in your name, organization, where you're dialing in from, and why is this of interest to you? So just let us get to know you a bit. You've taken time to join us. It'll be very good for us to know as we get into the presentation why this is of importance to you. Welcome once again. So your name, your organization, where you're dialing in from, and why this is important to you. We've interestingly had a lot of interest, not just from South Africa, but from outside as well. This is great to see. Thank you, Kain from DG Mari Trust. Devalt from Stellenbosch, welcome. Bernard from MasterCard Foundation, nice to have you here. I hope I get this pronunciation right. Retha or Retha from Vela Trust. Give me a thumbs up if I've got your pronunciation right. Beatrice from Anglo American, one of AVPA's new members. It's great to have you on the call. Excellent. Laura, how do we apply innovative finance to improve access to education in the Eastern Cape? Elsie, nice to have you. Gillian from Bartha Center, always good to have you. Thank you for joining us. Mame Awa from Senegal MasterCard Foundation. It's great to have you. My longtime friend Nomsa, it's awesome. Always good to see you, Nomsa. Thank you for joining us. So we're going to get started, and once again, we're really super excited about being part of this work. And before we even get started, I'd like to say a big thank you to our funders, the FirstRand Empowerment Fund, for funding the study, which we believe will add a lot of value to just how we think about mobilizing sustainable finance to drive South Africa's long-term development agenda. And also like to thank Claire and the team at Deloitte for the work they did pulling the study together. And lastly, I'd love to thank the people who gave us time to be interviewed for this report. And you'll see their names. There are about 40 of them, all of them thought leaders in the impact investing space in South Africa. My name is Frank Aswani. I'm the CEO at AVPA, and we're really pleased to have you here today. AVPA is a Pan-African network of impact and social investors. For those of you who are meeting us for the first time today, we bring together people deploying grants, debt, and equity into the impact space and see how we can support them to maximize impact in how they deploy capital. The space of innovative finance, as much as we're talking about it from with the words finance in the title, is not something or a space just for the private sector. And you'll hear as we go through this research findings that the space of innovative finance is a critical part that has to be supported by everyone in the continuum of capital. So anyone doing grants, debt, or equity is a critical part of the success of this particular initiative. And so if you're here as a philanthropist or someone coming from a foundation, this is just as important to you as it is to someone who's doing debt and equity for impact. If anything, I personally think people holding on grants or people who are deploying grants with a slightly different paradigm and approach to how they deploy the grants are probably the most critical players for us if we're going to make a success of innovative finance. And in that context, I especially and particularly include governments as part of that continuum and value chain of unlocking capital for impact. I will not steal the thunder from Claire as we get to the report. But before we get into the report. Abby, do you want to run the poll? Please get your cell phones ready. For those of you who've been part of AVPA, you will have seen this before. We use an app called Slido to just get to know each other a bit better before we get into the crux of it. Can you please get your phones ready? Would love to engage you on 2 quick questions. So if you can just use that QR code to connect to some questions. Okay, you should get into Slido, or if you can't get the QR code, go into slido.com and use that number that's on the screen, hashtag 3127954. And that's the first question. What do you think is the greatest challenge facing this space in the South African environment, the impact investing space? We'll take another 15, 20 seconds. Okay, another 10 seconds. For those of you who are joining, welcome. Please use your cell phone to just follow through onto the QR code or go to slido.com and use the number on the screen to participate in our poll. We're asking, what do you think is the greatest challenge facing the impact investing environment in South Africa? Right. An overwhelming number, about half the audience thinks it's between lack of clarity in definition and framework and the lack of impact investing knowledge and education. Okay. And then there's quite a bit of people who believe lack of capital flow and few current opportunities, non-consensus between key market players, 15%, impact washing and potential for tick box exercises. Yes, where you get compliance over commitment, about 15%, and the macroeconomic environment is also a major factor to where we are. Okay, excellent. Abid, can we run the second poll? Once again, folks, use your cell phones to connect to this. What do you think is the reason for the lack of adoption of innovative finance? We'll run this for another 15 or so seconds. We've got about 38 people who've polled so far. So lack of familiarity, lack of knowledge, lack of information seems to be the leading cause for why we haven't done more in this space in South Africa. Okay, Claire, this will be interesting as we talk through the report findings to try and see how we can shed some more light on this. Okay, another 5 seconds, then I'll close the poll. Right, so overwhelmingly, unfamiliarity is a big thing, complexity in design, lack of collaboration, a grant culture, interesting. Early funding limitations, which, around how do you fund for risk and innovation. I'm assuming that's what people there were talking about. Using foreign system had zero. Interesting. Okay, excellent. So so let me thank you, Abby. We can close the poll now. So I want to open the floor now for Claire to do that. But before she goes in there, a quick just announcement on some things that you shall be seeing from AVPA with regards to what you can do to engage, to get more familiar with the space of innovative finance. We've got some really exciting things coming up. We've got a webinar next Friday with Tom Hall from UBS Optimus talking about the rise of the impact economy. So how do we move the world from just the rise of the production economy to the impact economy? And UBS have done a really interesting report that we shall be discussing. And then for those of you who are philanthropists, and as I mentioned earlier, the bridesmaids in us being successful in this innovative financing space are people who are sitting on grants, and I say include governments, because and you'll hear a bit of that from Claire's presentation, but it's very important that we start thinking about how do we bring the grant makers together and to pool their resources so we can do more and try and deliver multiplier effects collectively, where we share risk, but we magnify impact. And those of you who are sitting on any grant money, whether you're high net worth individuals, family offices, or foundations, you are welcome to join us for that activity. The webinar will be on the 12th of September, and you can find details on our events page. And then some training programs that are upcoming. The Africa Impact Investing Fellowship Program is in its third year today. If you're still interested in joining us, we kick off the program next week, Thursday. You can still sign up for that program. Very, very popular program. You will be in a cohort with other Africans from organizations that have got an interest in the impact space, who want to learn on how to be better impact practitioners. We also are very excited to be creating arguably Africa's first impact investing climate forum, the Africa Climate Investing Forum. So please look out for that. And very importantly, and tied to the philanthropic pool funds and the need to build more risk capital on the continent, we shall be rolling out a catalytic investing training program in partnership with UCT and the C3, which is a catalytic capital consortium. And lastly, as you know, we are formally open for membership as AVPA. So do please go to our website to get more information on our membership application process. So lastly, if you want all of this information, do please send us an email and at info@avpa.africa, or reach out to us on LinkedIn, either as an organization or any of us as AVPA employees. So do please make use of all the various channels to connect with us. Without further ado, I do want to bring in Claire. Claire is from Deloitte. They were our research partners through this process, and we're super proud to have worked with the Deloitte team to get to today and share these findings. So Claire, over to you.
Thanks very much, Frank.
As Claire's getting ready, please, if you have any questions during Claire's presentation, just put them in the chat. I will moderate the Q&A and we'll try and get to as many of the questions as you put in the chat as we possibly can. So Claire, over to you.
Presume my screen is showing all right, the presentation, Frank?
Yes, all good, all good.
All right, all good. Brilliant. All right, so we'll get straight into this. So, yeah, thanks to Frank. We really enjoyed sort of doing this work with AVPA, and really the crux of the project was really the research project was really looking at the state of innovative finance in South Africa. So we really wanted to understand where South Africa was at with respect to innovative finance, as well as impact investing opportunities. So we could assess the business case, and obviously, I think more importantly, focus on what can we do next, sort of a call to arms, given the critical need for impact investing and the use of innovative finance to meet sort of the demand for impact investing in South Africa. So as you all well know, South Africa is in quite a, I think, precarious sort of economic position at the moment. You know, both, I think, due to internal factors, external factors, economic stagnation. We've got a constrained fiscus. constrained fiscus, confidence is at an all-time low. So if you add this to sort of the sustainable development goals, which obviously were born out of sort of originally as the MDGs, and they evolved to become the Sustainable Development Goals. So, that whole evolution sort of put into the spotlight the need for innovative finance, which really just helps with the mechanism, efficiency, and effectiveness of financial flows that traditional finance mechanisms don't meet, or traditional development finance institutions don't meet. And as well as this evolution of impact investing, where investors really want to align their financial goals with making an impact in society. So, I mean, the crux of the the research was really, where are we at in South Africa, and what we can do sort of to I think build impetus in the innovative finance and impact investing space. So, I mean, this project was largely based on interviews with leading stakeholders, so across sort of donor organizations, asset management firms, and the likes, and banks. So let's just take maybe a step back and just look at innovative finance. And as I mentioned, this really sort of the whole sort of term and the sector of innovative finance really developed through first the MDGs in the early 2000s. And this sort of innovative finance was really seen as a way to sort of access finance, capital, etc., through methods that weren't really sort of being met through traditional finance allocation methods. So just to remind ourselves, so innovative finance really is there to alter the cost of return and the cost of capital and return. So we will sort of look at various mechanisms, but it does this by sort of taking, say, your traditional sort of financing mechanisms, which is really typically debt and equity finance, and altering some of the characteristics there. So, for example, with debt and debt financing, your innovative finance will really give you maybe loans with longer payback periods. More importantly, also loans with maybe lower interest rates, etc., as a way sort of to meet this sort of gap in the traditional finance flow model. Equity finance, again, there are derivations there, looking at quasi-equity, where loans will be given whereby the owner of a business, say a small business, doesn't have to give up ownership of the business. We also look at traditional grant funding in that, I think, and we'll touch on this in one of the big themes that came out of this research, has traditionally been there as a way of sort of providing finance to impact investing projects. But obviously, this is also taking an evolution of its own. So we look at venture philanthropy, which sort of takes your techniques and characteristics out of venture capital and applies this to then providing funding to social ventures. So other forms of innovative finance that we've seen sort of evolve is catalytic capital. So this very much focuses on the early stage of sort of an organization, whereby the risk is really, really high, and your conventional commercial lenders do not want to sort of obviously invest, given the high level of risk. I think a big sort of common one that's coming up with our just transition, the just transition is green bonds. Credit guarantees has also sort of become quite an established sort of method of innovative finance. Crowdfunding in digital assets, that's another sort of rising star. I think the one I know the most is the Sun Exchange, which really uses sort of cryptocurrency to allow peer-to-peer funding for the provision of solar panels, obviously, then also aiding sort of a just transition. And then the other various sort of other instruments, blended finance instruments that really have come into the world. All right, so taking innovative finance, and looking at South Africa, its private capital markets, sort of where we are at, and really is there potential. I mean, I think we all know there is sort of a significant potential in this country. I was in an audit committee, an audit planning meeting earlier today, where we had sort of the head of the Stanley Supermoni sort of say, give an overview of where South Africa was at, and obviously the extreme challenges that we face at the moment. But I mean, his one comment is South Africa is not short of funds. So if we look at our private sort of capital markets, we obviously have a very well-funded institutional, particularly retirement funds. If you look at sort of funds under management there, sitting at probably just under 5 trillion rand. Obviously, they're free assets of banks, other institutional investors, your development finance institutions, private equity, as well as then also, I think, your private investors that Frank alluded to earlier, sort of your family units, that can play sort of an important sort of role in releasing capital funds to impact investing and innovative finance. And I think we really have touched on the need for innovative finance. I think South Africa, just to iterate, I think there's a desperate need, not only just to meet our SDG targets, but just given our current economic stagnation, as well as I think, to really focus on the triple challenges of inequality, poverty, and unemployment in this country. So I think let's move on really to what we were trying to assess when we were interviewing the various stakeholders for this project, especially with respect to impact investing. Right. So the first question we really asked them is, what is impact investing? Just to gauge was there a consensus currently in South Africa as to what impact investing is? And then as well as sort of, where there were sort of divergences in views. So the majority of stakeholders agreed with the GIN definition of impact investing, which really defines impact investing as investments made into companies, organizations, and funds with the intention to generate not only social but environmental impact alongside financial returns. However, we did see a divergence where, when it came to the rank of importance of impact versus where impact sat relative to the return that would be earned on an impact investment. So there was a whole range of sort of views where sort of the return would sit. So impact investing, as per the GIN definition, really sits, as per the stakeholders that we interviewed, really was to a market rate return, as well as including the range to a below market rate return. And that really covers sort of the space sitting, I would say, above your philanthropy or foundation, who really make grants with no expectation of return, but obviously an expectation of making impact. So impact investing, therefore, doesn't really fall into that traditional investing sort of realm, given that it does focus on return, on making an impact alongside with the return. All right. Quite interesting is when we looked at some of the literature that had come up, there was an sort of international survey on the target returns of impact investors. So we're just trying to gauge where South African impact investors sat compared to what came out of this survey. So 67% of impact investors sort of target market rate returns on a risk-adjusted basis. So I think that was quite interesting, and that the view then internationally was that, impact investing, you can earn a market-related return, obviously on a risk-adjusted basis, as well as making an impact. Sorry, I just want to keep on getting notifications. All right, so if we look at then the trade-off, which I've touched on briefly, between impact and return. So, there were quite divergent views here. So, on the one side, many stakeholders thought there was no trade-off, and that if you have experienced investors who really have a good eye for an opportunity, then you are able to make an investment that not only generates a positive return, but also a positive impact. One sort of interesting, if we delved into this a bit more, many stakeholders sort of raised the fact that in the past, when measuring financial returns, not obviously all impacts and metrics were considered. So, such as your opportunity cost. So if you think in the past, sort of environmental degradation, if you actually factored that into measuring financial return, then traditional investments were not necessarily as attractive as they have been seen in the past. Some sort of a portion, obviously, of the stakeholders thought there was a trade-off. So this, and that the size of the trade-off really depends on which sector that the impact investment is being made. So if you look, say, maybe clean energy, the trade-off probably isn't as sizable, or doesn't really exist, say in the movement from coal to solar energy, in that. So yeah. And then also some impact investors said only investment should only really be made in sectors which do not demand a compromise of financial returns and impact. So that really was sort of some, to view what sort of, to assess what views sort of existed in terms of whether stakeholders thought there was a trade-off or there wasn't a trade-off. Sorry, there we go. So another aspect that we really wanted to look at was measuring impact performance. So we first sort of asked stakeholders on their views of the importance of measuring impact, and sort of what good practices were to follow. So I mean, there was sort of I think we identified from stakeholders, they do believe there is a clear need to sort of be able to demonstrate impact. And that this was very important in demonstrating the fact that impact can exist alongside financial return. And then without being able to do this, you wouldn't be able to access further funding. And if we are going to grow sort of impact investing and innovative finance within South Africa, that really, there was a significant sort of need to be able to demonstrate and measure impact. If we look at then good practice when measuring impact, the key themes that came out here were, I think the reliance on independent service providers to provide verification of performance results was a strong theme that came out. Obviously, in measuring anything, particularly impact, you need good, sufficient data that is of good enough quality to be able to sort of accurately measure the impact that has been made. And then they sort of, we touched on sort of quite a sort of maybe technical side of impact investing, and that's looking at the impact thesis, and that should be really defined right at the start of the investment, and then sort of integrated into the key objectives, which will then drive the metrics that need to be measured. This will also then help derive a theory of change, and for those, that really looks at your inputs, your immediate outputs, your longer term change as well, that should arise from impact investing. Obviously, a very interesting part of looking at measuring impact performance was actually then looking at the burden of impact measurement and the challenges involved. So obviously, there is going to always be a burden on especially smaller organizations. So measuring impact can take up a lot of time, and it is obviously costly for smaller organizations. So if we sort of look back and say sort of the theme that came out was, impact investors really, they look to independent third-party organizations to verify impact. This obviously that cost would be quite sort of burdensome to smaller organizations. measuring impact as well also depends on the sector where the investment has been made. So obviously, if you look at green energy, so measuring a reduction in CO2 emissions is obviously far easier than looking at measuring improvement in health. Or, for example, education over the medium and long term, and also looking at what, any improvements in health and education can do for a population society in terms of economic development over the medium and long term. There's also sort of a barrier in terms of attribution. So looking at the calculation of impact performance is then, you obviously have to really focus on and try and isolate what impact has specifically been generated by a certain investment, and take into account there may be other factors at play which may also then impact sort of the outcome of the investment. And then obviously, with any data, there will be challenge, especially all my work I've seen, particularly in the public sector. You need data. What data do you need? So that is sometimes very hard to define at the start. And then obviously, if it's going to be low quality data, there are going to be sort of qualifications as to what sort of the numbers are telling you. All right. So then we looked at looking at then impact measurement, should we, looking at then developing a framework for impact measurement. So there are sort of at the moment a couple of frameworks in the market that have been used internationally, but there is no standardized approach currently, specifically looking at South Africa to measuring and managing impact. So GIN obviously offers their own sort of system, but there are sort of a couple of other frameworks out there. So a lot of the stakeholders sort of raised the point that there's been much work in obviously trying to invent frameworks for and metrics, which are then easily and effectively used to measure impact performances. And any development of a common framework will obviously bring transparency and will enable investments to be easily compared. However, some stakeholders, feel that not too much time should be focused on the development of a framework, and that should instead be looking at the actual impact that is being made. Given that obviously there is a burden, and there are a number of burdens that fall, particularly on the smaller participants, and there's some difficulties, particularly in certain sectors, of actually measuring impact. So we did ask what stakeholders really thought of the current impact investing environment in South Africa. So there was sort of a consensus that, the market is small at the moment, but it is growing. And obviously, I think with the whole sort of focus on SDGs, etc., and our current sort of economic climate and the challenges facing this country, obviously it had become very topical in recent years. But there was a sort of feeling that the environment is very undeveloped at the moment. There's still a lack of education. So this point came out quite strongly. So lack of education in the space, as well as a lack of awareness of the matters sort of that you would sort of cover when, or matters pertaining to impact investing. I think Frank touched on this right at the start with the poll, but there is obviously a feeling among stakeholders, which, and just a reminder, stakeholders, we did interview sort of a range of stakeholders, not only from donor organizations, but from asset management companies to banks, etc. So there was a feeling that there's still a very strong reliance of grants in the impact investing space, but I think this has really come that grant has the provision of grants has been sort of your traditional source of finance within the space. And this has really hindered the execution of sort of and further use of innovative finance instruments, which we touched on earlier, which are really needed to develop the market. And obviously, I think I think as we all know, the South Africa has very well developed capital markets, and that, you know, given our sort of range of social issues, poverty, inequality, and unemployment, particularly youth unemployment, really does make us, in the view really among stakeholders, is it makes us our environment very unique in that it really is prime for impact investing opportunities. So another important aspect to look at, and I think particularly if we want to sort of look at a call to action in South Africa with regards to impact investing, is, you know, what were the stakeholders' thoughts on the regulatory environment, as well as the risk appetite of South African investors. So if we look really first at the risk appetite of South African investments, I think overall the consensus is investors on the whole very short-term based, on you know, and also just prioritize bottom line returns above all. We are on the whole risk averse, and then which means we probably haven't, given the size of our capital markets and the size of funding that could potentially be available, we haven't really experimented as much as we should do with innovative finance tools. And this may also be due to unfamiliarity. Resulting from this is obviously there are many early stage projects which really need capital at the early stage of development, that which means there's really a shortage for these of capital for these early stage projects. And then sort of the additional risk of impact investing needs to sort of, the thoughts were that the additional risk of impact investments really should be carry additional return. But again, the impact investments are usually made with a long-term horizon, and this also then adds to the risk to the investor. And this is probably why many commercial players have not, or have been very slow to invest within the space. So then if we focus on regulation, which always brings, I think, mixed views, no matter which sort of issue you're looking at. So the mixed views were obviously the arguments for less regulation and the usual sort of traditional arguments of why less regulation should be advantage is that regulation tends to stymie innovation, slow down the market, etc. There was also feel that the lack of consensus amongst market players also made it very difficult to give direction to government on where regulation is actually needed in this space. Some of the arguments for regulation was, particularly this was very interesting, was the need for clarification with regards to tax treatment of certain organizations. So, the donor, philanthropic and foundation organizations indicated that if they sort of made a profit, they risk losing their PBO status. And there are obviously certain tax benefits that are associated with that PBO status. So that is probably sort of where regulation should look at, particularly if you want to encourage the development or, and the size of the impact investing space. And there was also a need, sort of an argument that better regulation certainty from government to better guide and develop the impact investing environment. So then, another sort of area we wanted to look into was looking at stakeholders' thoughts on the use of innovative finance tools. So, as we've touched on in the earlier slides, there's definitely sort of a shortage of risk capital. If you look at that early stage sort of funding that's needed, the early stage of organizations, and at the moment, sort of grants are commonly used in this space for impact investing. But more sustainable and flexible solutions are needed for lenders, as well as organizations receiving funding. And these early stage projects really require risk tolerant sort of capital, probably what we would call patient capital, and repayment flexibility. So there was definitely no shortage of capital in South Africa, as we know, but I think capital, especially this sort of patient capital, catalytic capital that's needed right at the early stage development, at the early stage of development in an organization, was really sort of lacking in this country. And then sort of just many impact investments then don't have the right risk return profile. I mean, if you look at the South African retirement industry, if you're studying sort of at 5 trillion rands worth of assets, you've got to ask yourself why is sort of not even sort of maybe 1% being sort of geared towards impact investing. So it really, I think there's a need to look at how innovative finance tools can really modify that risk return profile that currently sits in the impact investment space, so it can actually be made more attractive to our providers of capital in this country. This was, I think, interesting. So we touched on the poll, but these were the thoughts, the sort of clear themes that came out to the reasons for a lack of implementation of innovative finance. So, first of all, grant culture. The early funding limitations that we've touched on, complexity in design of some of the innovative finance instruments. I think that's quite interesting, and that really points to sort of more education, familiarity, and I suppose more marketing of these tools. There was a view that we're sort of reusing foreign systems and we're copying and pasting them in South Africa, and this may not be sort of appropriate, not only for South Africa, but for Africa. The unfamiliarity probably touches on that complexity in design, that, there's a lack of education, awareness with innovative finance methods, and this really has deterred investors away from this space. And then the last of the major themes coming out of this was the lack of collaboration. So investors not viewing themselves as part of a capital continuum which hinders collaboration in funding impact projects. All right, so after we sort of went through all these, I think, sort of areas we covered in the stakeholder interviews, sort of picking up on the major themes that came out, we really was then what we obviously have concluded, and much of the conclusions we've covered already, but really is how, what are the recommendations then that follow such an exercise, really, and, that call to arms really to mobilize more impact investing in South Africa, and the use of innovative finance to help meet the need for the demand for impact investing. So the first sort of big sort of recommendation area was sort of greater impact awareness and education. So looking at academic institutions to provide courses, on impact investing, etc., bringing that into the curriculum. Probably a need to then share from those sort of entities that do impact investing case studies. You almost need to create impact communities of practice, of best practice, to actually then market, educate for, the broader investment community out there, to help sort of, and aid peer-to-peer lending, to break down these investment silos that I think we do see in South Africa, and to encourage collaboration amongst the various providers of capital within our economy. We then also, sort of second big recommendation was around better standardization, improved impact measurement. So there definitely needs to be more research and training on measuring impact, but at the same time, while doing this, just to sort of also be aware of the fact that sort of any requirements can be too burdensome, especially in your smaller organizations. Need to support, then a third area was support the mobilization, deployment of more catalytic pools of capital. So it really does sort of speak to that early stage funding that's needed with impact investing. And, one way to do this would be to increase education and training on catalytic capital, and then maybe also just look at the building of funds that really focus, and players that focus on this area. And then the fourth one really came through the regulation, the regulatory involvement, and the market correction and that really was looking at better dialogue amongst the impact investing community and National Treasury, who will be responsible, obviously, for driving any regulatory change in this area. There definitely needs to be clearer tax guidelines for public benefit organizations, and probably maybe a revision, particularly if we want to encourage impact investing. And obviously, one way of encouraging sort of any financial behavior is looking at tax guidelines and breaks. And then the third sort of point under this was to look at sort of look internationally, look at regulatory regimes which can create an enabling environment without stifling innovation and becoming too burdensome. Obviously, related to not only the recommendations, we're looking sort of where we could go next following this project, as we see this sort of maybe just at the as the early stage research that really should, I think, encourage further and sort of mobilize further research in the space. So we probably sort of more work maybe needs to be looked at that standardization of impact frameworks, especially their customization to South Africa and to the continent. Within Africa, just noting sort of solutions in the West should not always be copied and pasted within the continent. The development of a scalable investor readiness program to impact your SMEs and projects. We need to then look at integrating social impact curriculums into tertiary education programs. I think particularly looking at your business schools, etc., development finance programs. We need to look then at perspectives in the balancing of returns and risks and the impact among different impact investors to see how they can sort of fill this, the continuum of capital providers that are needed within the impact investing space. There needs to obviously be a review of South African regulation and the policies and associated policies to enhance impact investing. And the last area of the sort of 6 broad research areas was just looking at benchmarking South African impact regulations against other global South countries to ensure that our regulations are really providing that enabling environment. Okay, thank you.
Claire, thank you so much. Thank you so much, not only for the work you've done, but also for the presentation. So this is a time when we're going to take in questions from the audience. So please do put in your questions in the chat. But before we go there, we've got one more poll. Abby, can you put the poll before we take questions from the audience? But in the meantime, please do put your questions in the audience. Once again, use your Slido function and answer the question. Based on today's presentation, do you believe innovative finance has a significant role to play in driving South Africa's sustainable development? Let's take another 30 or so seconds. So it seems like overwhelmingly to the respondents so far think that there is a space for innovative finance. It should be, but there's a lack of imagination and innovation, not just for South Africa, but for the rest of the continent. Okay, and for everyone who's on the call who's asked about the report, it should be made available to all of you from today when we send out the recording, and you'll have a link to the report. So would be very keen to get your feedback and any responses. And those of you who've had a look at, you've also seen the not only the recommendation but additional areas of research. If any of those interest you, do please come back to us and let's see we can partner together to try and unpack a lot more of these areas, because there's just so much we don't know yet that with additional information we can make more informed decision. So I would be asking you, so please put your questions, thoughts on the chat and we'll take them shortly. Governments have a role to play in this. It's I'm still unclear of the exact value proposition and where it's best deployed. Okay, good. Will take a while to get going. There's a lot that needs to be in place in organizations for process structures to make this possible. It should, okay, without a doubt. Cool. So I think we've got some thoughts and comments around this. Maybe we can close the poll and start taking a couple of questions. So as we speak, I'm dialing in to you from Brazil, and I came to attend an impact conference in Brazil. As you know, AVPA has sister networks in Asia, Latin America, and Europe. And one of the benefits you get from being a member of AVPA is you get to also get concessional rates to attend some of these member conferences in other regions that our sister networks organize. And this is the second in the global south that I'm attending. I was here a couple of weeks back to attend the Asian one, and everyone is battling with the same problems. So this conversation we're having today is very timely. In fact, I think this is the only report I've seen of this nature in the global south so far. There may be one or two that I've missed, but to the best of my knowledge, it's the only one I've seen. So it sets the scene really nicely, not just for us to start having these conversations in South Africa, but start looking at what we need to do to get this kind of information and data for the rest of the continent. So the timing of this could not be any better. That's the first thing. The second thing that I've learned a lot is, the rest of the world is trying to move very fast in closing this gap. We only have 7 years to the end of the 2030 SDG targets. We don't have time to try and play too safe. We need to have a bit of an appetite for greater risk, a sense of urgency. And as I mentioned and spoke to attend the AVPA launch weeks back, is to close a primary school of the continent every hour. Pick a country. Pick South Africa and say every hour, let's close a primary school, commanding a lot more urgency from our side. And that's what we're hoping.
Frank, sorry, I think we're losing
some
you.
of these conversations will stimulate.
Good afternoon.
Frank, we are losing you.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, you're back.
That's better. Thanks.
Yes. I'm sorry. The Wi-Fi where I'm at is not great, so I'll try and start taking some questions in here that the audience has put in the chat. I'll take the one that and Claire, maybe you can answer this question that came from Zanatul Fardos. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. And the question, he or she, I'm not sure whether it's a he or she, has two questions in there. I'll take. Sorry, guys, my Wi-Fi is really bad. So there's the second question where he or she talks about the state of innovative finance and where South Africa is. Do you want to take that question, Claire? And I can take the first one.
Is that sort of South Africa, the question, South Africa has a real opportunity to be a leader?
Yes.
Innovate, but has a tendency of a follower mindset, yes, as opposed to a leader mindset. So what steps should we take as a community? So I would say if we go back to those recommendations, it's really starting to set up those sort of communities of practice within the investments, impact investing space and innovative finance space. So that would be sort of focusing on, if we look at who we interviewed stakeholders, so that's not only donor organizations, that's asset managers, those, banks, etc., who have sort of started or set up funds that do focus. I think first step is just to get people, I think, together and to start talking about impact investing. I think from there, you can set up industry sort of lobby groups. The word lobby sometimes does have bad connotations to it. And then I think it's just to get it out there on the policy agenda. That's where I think we would start. As Frank said, this is the first report really he's seen that even touches on, where are we, or any global South country, where are they in terms of impact investing / innovative finance, and how do we take this forward to make it more, I think, mainstream and acceptable.
Yeah, and as we look at this space, Claire, I think what's very clear is the opportunity cost. We are in a space where aid to Africa, South Africa, is declining. Our government's financing is under huge pressure. So we've got to ask ourselves, well, where are we going to get money from to fund our social needs? And private capital markets have a lot more money than we can imagine. But they look at this space and they think it's too risky. We can't make the kind of returns that are expected from our investors, so on and so forth. So they stay away from this space. So how do we try and incentivize or encourage the private sector, private capital players to put money into this space? And how do we converge profit and purpose? And in this case, we're talking about not just investors, but also corporates. We're talking about governments. We're talking about people like DFIs. All these people sitting in private capital markets, which have about $430 trillion compared to the $4.3 trillion the world needs to sort out our SDGs. That's the only way we can get money. So we've got to be thinking about then how do we really embrace innovative finance to try and de-risk social investments so we can crowd in more private capital, because that's a much bigger pool of capital sitting in the private capital markets. So that's why the study also starts bringing us to the space where we can start asking some of these questions and engaging sort of non-traditional partners in our conversations as we seek a way forward.
Can I just, this is Anat. Thank you, Claire. Thanks, Frank, for your response. I guess to be very specific, I think what would be really useful is following sort of this analysis to sort of have some specific next step. I understand how, you can't be too specific, and I applaud AVPA for the conference that was done last month and all the initiatives, because even based in South Africa, I find it quite difficult to pinpoint who are the key actors. What are the conversations happening? The collaborative bodies are not working always as transparently as I would hope. So it would be really good to sort of build more conversations and dialogue around this community of practice so that you can bring this new thoughts. And as you rightly put, Africa has been receiving aid for many, many years. So this is the new era where you could sort of use the private capital in a more structured way towards the development goal. So there's a real opportunity, and South Africa is ripe for it, not just to receive it, but also channel more capital towards Africa. So there's such a huge opportunity. So yeah, as a follow-up of this, if there could be sort of more consistent dialogues, conversations, to make this more mainstream. I think, I mean, personally, from me and my organization, Agora, we would be definitely very keen to be part of that, because we are sort of technically advising some investments in South Africa for funds globally.
Yeah. And thank you. I mean, you're asking totally the right question, and that's why we exist. Bodies like us, like Impact Investing South Africa, exist to do exactly this: is to start these conversations and create the communities of impact. I'm actually calling them communities of impact, that would then advance these conversations from just discussions to action. So do please watch out for this space. We shall be seeking to take this study into a more granular space where we can talk and unpack a bit more and actually try and find what are actionable steps we can take post the study. Absolutely correct. And this is just the beginning for us to start having this conversation. And then there was a question from Wiswa here, from Bernard's question: what role can foundations play in the innovative financing space? As I mentioned to you earlier, I strongly believe the world of impact, and I think Claire did the same, we're not short of money, we're short of risk capital. The biggest amount of money we're lacking is risk capital to test new markets, new products, new services, fund innovation, and fund scaling. And foundations or people holding grants, and I include governments in here, are the only people who've got the kind of risk-seeking capital. I say risk-seeking capital, that we can then use to do some of these innovative financing structures, blend finance. You'll hear a lot of talking a bit later about blending finance and those kind of things that will then get some of these opportunities to a point where they can attract more follow-on capital for scale. So anyone around the innovative financing space, please, I encourage you to, if you can, join our catalytic investment training program or join our philanthropic fund webinar next week, because that's exactly what we're going to be talking about, is how do we help you, in addition to being a traditional philanthropist, for example, also become a catalytic investor, where the question you're asking is, for every dollar I'm putting in, how many dollars of private capital am I unlocking? Is it $5, $10, $20? And that, how do we help you magnify your impact from that approach? So foundations or anyone sitting on grants is the most important puzzle if we're going to unlock the kind of capital required, and the risk social investments for private capital players to put money into this. So absolutely correct. And then someone who has asked here, how can the study be used to influence or lobbying governments? Is there a target that can be set annually, KPIs that then drives us as an initiative by AVPA in South Africa, particularly as it relates to policy regulation? Claire, can you go first with that one? Just when you think about how this study could be used to engage governments and policymakers. I have an idea of what we shall be looking to do at AVPA, but I'd like you to give a bird's eye view first.
So Frank, that's on how we should engage policymakers.
Yes.
So I think I'm a firm believer in sort of looking at sort of what the evidence says. And at the moment, I guess, we can look at what's been done internationally. I think especially, I mean, the focus has been, and you're saying you're in Brazil, but looking at sort of the countries we are, that are in a similar, I think, predicament that as we are, so Brazil, sort of India, etc. What has worked there? I think some proper research, I think pertaining to that, and looking at sort of, I think what has been achieved here to date. So definitely very evidence-based. And then sort of using that to formulate sort of further sort of recommendations, and what should be done from a policy sort of point of view is the best way to engage. And then obviously there's a question of how do you engage with the policy makers, but I do sort of believe that it really all lies in your benchmarking and your research, and what the evidence-based that leads to evidence-based policy making.
Yeah, and just to build on what you've said, Claire, totally correct. One of the things I'm also learning just as I traverse the global south is we should not just look internally for policy solutions. There's a lot of people who have solved these problems that we're battling with right now and are 5-10 years ahead of us. We can really once again accelerate our learning by just tapping into what the Southeast Asians have done. Brazil has done some really interesting work, especially like policies around food security and how they've captured capital, that job creation. So in as much as we're trying to innovate internally, and of course it needs local context, we've got to be thinking about how do we also accelerate our learning by looking externally, because there is a huge opportunity cost by us going too slowly, as I said. Every time we sit in here and we don't make a decision, by the end of the day, there are 24,000 less jobs we've created for young people on the continent every single day. Okay? So we've got to be thinking about that. And AVPA will be very deliberate about working with policymakers, and we're very, very deliberate about not leaving governments behind. One of the things we've learned from the era of aid and investments is too many times we ignored governments, and they're such an important part, an integral part of this journey, that we've got to make sure that they understand the things we're trying to do, so that when they're thinking about policy changes and we go to them talk about policy iterations, they have context. Okay. So we're very deliberate, for example, in our programs to try and welcome government officials to join even our impact investing programs and other programs, so they can learn about the evolution of this space and stay on top of things. So when we go and talk to them, they're not coming from a blind spot. They're not coming from an area of ignorance. So that's a very particularly important thing for us to consider. There was another question, Claire, that talked about when you describe the demand for impact investing, where is this demand? It would be helpful to clarify what the space where impact investing is best placed. It seems that there's need for there to be tolerance for below market returns. I can understand that people may be prioritizing returns currently. Is there a market for large institutional service providers to offer financial products that exclude investing, that don't generate social returns? So particularly that last question, is there a market for large institutional service providers to offer financial products that exclude investing, that don't generate social returns? What's your view?
I was just finding the question. Is there a market for large?
Yeah.
Exclude. Don't generate social returns. Sorry, I'm probably not really understanding what's been asked. Is there a market for large institution service providers to offer financial products which exclude investing?
Yeah.
Don't.
So I can take a stab at that.
Yeah, sure. Maybe you.
I think there always is. If anything, that is the current existing market.
That is the existing, yeah.
Yeah, where we do nothing different. The question we have to ask ourselves is, do we want to be that organization? Do we want to be that African organization that's totally oblivious of the realities around us? Or do we want to be the kind of organization that demonstrates care, that demonstrates responsibility, that demonstrates social and cultural empathy in the space that we operate? And I think what the last few crises have shown us, whether you talk about COVID or whatever, is when some of these tough times hit, they don't pick and choose you being a private corporate or someone else. It hits us just as bad. The virus hit all of us equally. Okay, the lack of vaccination capabilities in Africa, what's happening in the Russia-Ukraine war, how the Ukraine war can affect food supply to Africa baffles me. And if we don't come out of this crisis better than we went in, history will judge us harshly. So my question would be that when you in the organizations and corporates that you work for, are you responsible African corporates? Are you being deliberate, for example, in the way that you do business to address some of these gaps? Is your supply chain gender sensitive, or is it predominantly male? In an era when we need to be thinking about how do we provide opportunities for women? Is your supply chain deliberately trying to do provide opportunity for young people. Because it's not, when people think about impact, it's not just about CSR. It's even in how we do business. Are we being deliberate? And this is where impact comes in, where we think about two things: additionality and intentionality. Are we being additional in adding to the greater good, okay, and moving beyond ESG? Because if you think about ESG, ESG is a risk mitigation framework. And also, are we being intentional about putting money where on its own it would not go? And so my question to you, to us, all of us, is how are we influencing our corporates and our organizations and where we work to be a lot more culturally sensitive and grounded? How are we being deliberate about making sure that the way we do business doesn't leave our spaces, our communities worse off than we found them? If anything, we should be adding value. So that's my response to that particular question. Is we've got to be this. And when you ask about to the person who asked the question, when you describe the demand for impact investing, where is this demand? The demand is in the people whose lives we're trying to improve. That's where the demand is. Okay. Every time we have unemployed youth, okay, the demand for impact investing is with those people. How are we doing something different to create jobs? It's not in our corporates, it's in our end beneficiaries, our brothers and sisters and kids of this continent and South Africa as a country. That's where the demand is. Okay. Kolisa, from Sanlam, you've raised your hand. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Sure. It's actually Tebo. I'm using Kolisa.
Yes. Yeah, I was also a bit confused myself.
There's two of us. I just liked that question you answered, and maybe I just wanted to bring why I liked it. My question I had was, the demand is there a demand from asset owners? So you mentioned that, there's a lot of money from pension funds and all these institutional. Is there, for asset managers, whoever, to get into a space, it seems like there's no real demand. There's still more of a demand of returns and maybe impact. So that disconnect in demand from the owners of capital, is it there? And how do we then generate a demand so that they can accept below market returns, if that's the offer or not? That's how I was reading the question.
Okay, and Teboho, so first of all, thank you for joining us. Thank you for your question. I think there's more than enough evidence today that shows profit and purpose are not mutually exclusive. There is multiple reports that have demonstrated that in addressing the SDGs, for example, there is plenty of impact of revenue generation opportunities. I'm not sure how many of you have read a report by Standard Chartered that came out a couple of years ago called Opportunities 2030, that talks about the opportunities in addressing 3 SDGs, 6, 7, and 9. And across about 5 African countries, just in one of those SDGs, I think was 6, there's like $150 billion of opportunities, where in your normal process of investing, you'd be addressing some of these key SDG gaps. So I think the mindset that still exists, and I think that still exists, that we can't do well as we do good, that is shifting largely across the world. And we're seeing that across LPs everywhere are demanding that their money does more than just give returns. And we have to believe that we can do that and find the right opportunities, the right partners to help us in not only thinking through some of these opportunities, but also in de-risking some of these opportunities. So that is something I strongly believe that asset managers should be a lot more deliberate about, and try and find, okay, if the risk returns of some of these projects don't meet, who can I partner with to maybe make that a bit more attractive for my investors? That is the question we need to do. And I think platforms like us, where we bring people who are working across the continuum of capital, of grants, debt, and equity, should be able to give you other partners for you to partner with. But it means you have to have the mindset that you can't do this alone, that you've got to be deliberate about partnerships, you've got to be deliberate about trying to find a structure that would work. And that's where innovative financing comes in. So where we'll then look at how we blend capital, how we do other types of structures to make that a possibility.
Thank you. That helps.
Okay. I'm trying to see what else. Oscar Njuguna says, I think there is scope to collaborate and learn that works in other countries and replicate across their solutions. I totally agree with you, Oscar. One of the things that I have picked out of being in Brazil this week is we as AVPA have to do something to try and bridge the gap and accelerate Africa's learning. The opportunity cost is too high. We can't afford go at snail's pace and count on organic growth and progress to do this. This is something we don't have time for as a continent. And I'm talking not just to the South African community, but I think South Africa specifically, because of the large financial services market it has, is probably best placed to drive the kind of innovation and innovative finance innovation that the rest of Africa could benefit from. So this is a big brother call to players in the South African space, that whatever we do here could inform the continent, but also we know that whatever we do in Africa is globally scalable. So whatever innovation we do here could literally change lives across the world, not just across the continent and not just across South Africa. Are there any other burning questions that we haven't missed? Otherwise, I would ask Claire to do a summary. Is there anything else? Just some closing remarks from Claire. I think Lebu here says enhanced investment strategy and investment execution are integral to the value proposition towards impact investing. We drive these strategies either through advisory or practical structuring of investment. Then we are halfway there. And you know, this is the reality, folks. We are very much in a nascent and learning phase. In many places, we don't know what we don't know. We have to take some risks. We've got to learn through the process. But I strongly believe that with the diversity of challenges that South Africa and Africa has, we should be the Ivy League of impact and innovative finance. No one else has the kind of opportunities to test new approaches than we do. No one else sits with the kind of impact opportunities than we do. In the next 5 to 10 years, we should be the place that people come to learn about innovative finance. But that means we've got to make some deliberate investments and deliberate decisions on how we move forward. It's still criminal, in my view, that as a continent that has such high need for impact, we only have one university that teaches impact investing. It's criminal that our master students leave university without having any sense of what SDGs or impact challenges the continent has. We've got to change some of those things, but we all have a role to play, and it's more important to get started than to get it perfect. And I think that's what we need to be thinking about. So in terms of the next steps, Anat, watch the space. In the next couple of weeks, we'll be communicating with you about what we'll do with the study and how we'll move it from a piece of publication to conversations that hopefully then drive us into some more concrete actions going forward. But I think your desire and passion for action is noted and is exactly what we need. So I think we'll take it from there. Claire, do you have any closing remarks?
I think, yeah, I mean, to wrap up this, really, I think this project was the start of a sort of a road that we need to go down, sort of the start of the call to arms. I think, you know, it's not just the SDG challenge. I think it's as Frank sort of, I think very well puts it, as the opportunity cost. I think particularly on this continent, and particularly where South Africa is at the moment, we can't continue with the status quo. And I think, you know, impact investing, innovative finance really provides sort of that mechanism to address and sort of configure that status quo, because ultimately, you know, if we don't action this, there is no sustainability of, you know, of returns in South Africa. Ultimately, this is going to lead to longer, sort of bigger returns for the whole of society, including your traditional investors, if we go down this path.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. And once again, thank you so much for your work. Before I call my colleague Voiso to do the closing part from AVPA, I just want to say you've been a star. Thank you so much for this process. I know it was onerous, it was hard work. I really appreciate your work on this. I'm hoping that all of us through this particular presentation have taken the fact that we're in a really exciting space, an exciting space where we can reshape the way forward in a more sustainable manner, where we can test and innovate and experiment and try and find ways that would give us a much better, secure future for the people on the continent. And we at AVPA are committed to really be part of this journey, to work with you, to bring you and connect you with people who you may not normally connect with, that could add value to you and you to them, to learn together, to use your discoveries and innovations to influence others to think in a different way. But it takes us to be able to own this and part of this. Part of what we'll be doing coming out of these sessions and in the next steps will be to also share where are the successes, what's happening out there, where is innovative financing working, where is it not, where are the gaps, and where can we get more data through research and other means to be able to once again improve the ways and capabilities that we have currently in addressing some of these issues. So I want to say thank you to everyone who's made time. This is always exciting when we're having these conversations, but this is just the beginning, and we shall be doing a lot more in days to come. And Vuiswa, over to you.
Thank you, Frank. And before I make my closing remarks, I'm just going to ask Abby to quickly project the slide of the upcoming events, just so people can make a quick note. So those are happening next week, and it would be great if people could sign up for those. And without further ado, we have got to be deliberate about the collaborative partnerships. And I think that was the theme from today's conversations. One of the most vociferous proponents of responsive governance is the CEO of BLSA. She says capital is like water. It goes where it's easy to flow. And I think from today's conversation, the inclusion and involvement of government in these conversations cannot be overemphasized, because they are the policymakers who must create that conducive macroeconomic environment for sustainable financing. And they really do need to be in the room to hear what's being said, but most importantly, to collaborate with the private sector, because we know that our governments are broke, and therefore there is a need for the private sector to step up. From the findings of this study, AVPA would like to see an increased innovative financing opportunities opening up, not just in South Africa, but in the continent. We'd also like to see that capital mobilization is enabled at the right speed, at the right scale, with the right collaborative partnerships in place. We'd also like to see an increased awareness and education around impact investing. And I think that point was made most prominently by the findings of this study. With those words, I would like to thank FREF, and I've seen Charmaine Nondo. I've also seen Lulu Gwagwa representing the foundation. Thank you very much for funding this work and generally supporting our work as AVPA. I'd like to thank the Deloitte team led by Claire. You've really done stellar work in doing this investigation from last year. The participants who were informants of this study, who were interviewed, who made time to answer all the questions that were raised by the team. Thank you very much. Last but not least, I would like to thank the people who've made an effort to attend this webinar. Thank you very much. And then the AVPA team, who work tirelessly to put out all these field-building convenings. May you grow from strength to strength. I know that some of our board members are also on this call. Thank you for taking the time. With those words, I wish you a great day and an awesome weekend further. Thank you and cheers.